She was only 9 years old. That afternoon, she left home carrying a few books to return to the library, a few coins in her pocket to buy candy, and the promise that she would be back before dinner, exactly like she did every single day. Carol Ann Dougherty was never late. But on October 22, 1962, she never came home. Hours later, her father would find his daughter's bicycle leaning outside a Catholic church in Bristol, Pennsylvania. The church door was open. Inside, the silence seemed normal, until he walked up to the church choir loft. What Frank Dougherty saw in that place destroyed his family forever. Decades later, Carol Ann Dougherty's younger sister would say she never forgot the sound her father made when he came out of there. It was not words. It was a muffled scream, a sound of despair so deep it seemed to come from someone who had just lost his own soul. Investigators believe this may be one of the only cases in United States history in which a child was assaulted and murdered inside a Catholic church. The place where she went in to pray. The place where she believed she was safe. But the man who walked in right behind her managed to disappear without leaving answers behind. For more than 60 years, he lived free. He moved to another state, built a family, hurt other victims, and believed he had committed the perfect crime. Until a secret hidden for decades finally began to surface. It was not a fingerprint. It was not a modern DNA database, nor a forgotten witness. It was a confession. A confession made years earlier in an isolated place known as Devil's Swamp, where the killer coldly told an acquaintance that he had sexually abused a little girl inside a church and killed her to keep her from talking. For more than 6 decades, the name Carol Ann Dougherty remained trapped inside a forgotten case file. But when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed something even more disturbing than investigators had ever imagined. In 1962, Bristol Borough was the kind of town where practically everyone knew each other. A small working-class community in Pennsylvania, surrounded by churches, Catholic schools, and quiet streets where children spent their afternoons riding bicycles without their parents worrying about them. The doors of houses were almost never locked. Families lived following strict and simple routines, shaped by religion and by a constant sense of safety. The Dougherty family was part of that environment. Frank Dougherty worked every day to support the household, while Dorothy kept everything running with exact schedules and discipline. Dinner was always served at the same time, without exceptions. Carol grew up in that protected environment. She was a girl known by teachers, neighbors, and classmates as polite, kind, and extremely innocent. She studied at St. Mark Catholic Church School and loved mystery books, the kind a child reads while imagining adventures far greater than the world she actually lived in. She also loved riding her bicycle and frequently pedaled through the streets of town, passing the local market, the library, and the small neighborhood shops. But there was something about her that everyone would remember afterward. Carol took religion very seriously. Whenever she passed in front of a church, she would go inside for a few minutes to pray. At that moment, it was not an obligation. It was simply something her parents and teachers had taught her since childhood, and something she naturally carried within herself. It was exactly that habit that made her vulnerable without anyone realizing it, and it was because of that habit that Carol lost her life, on the afternoon of October 22, 1962. It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon, but someone was watching that little girl's movements through the streets of Bristol. And when Carol entered St. Mark Church alone to say a quick prayer, she walked directly into the hands of the man who would destroy her life. The 9-year-old girl was brutally attacked, sexually assaulted, and strangled inside the very religious temple she had entered to pray in. Investigators concluded that the crime happened during the afternoon, while the streets outside continued moving normally. Nobody heard anything. Nobody realized what was happening inside that building. Police immediately sealed off the church and began one of the most shocking investigations in Bristol's history. At the scene, investigators found disturbing details that would remain preserved for decades. In Carol's left hand, there were several hairs tightly trapped between her fingers, probably ripped out during the struggle against the killer. Near the body, they also found a partially smoked Lucky Strike cigarette. At that moment, it seemed like just another ordinary detail. But years later, investigators would realize that cigarette may have belonged to the man responsible for the crime. The news spread rapidly throughout the town. And that same night, something changed in Bristol forever. Residents would remember for decades that it was the first time people began locking their doors before going to sleep. Because for the first time, everyone understood something terrifying. If someone could walk into a church during the day and murder a child inside it, then nobody was truly safe. The investigation began immediately. Bristol police officers and Pennsylvania state police agents spent the following days questioning residents, neighbors, and anyone who may have seen Carol Ann that afternoon. The entire town seemed paralyzed. Everyone wanted answers. Investigators reconstructed the girl's final movements and discovered that the attack happened within an extremely short window of time, while there was still activity on the streets surrounding the church. That made everything even more terrifying. The killer had committed the crime in broad daylight and managed to disappear without attracting attention. During the first few months, 4 men became suspects. The first was a local worker known for alcoholism and unstable behavior. During an intense interrogation, he even confessed to the murder. But investigators quickly realized something was wrong. The confession was full of contradictions, incorrect details, and information that did not match the crime scene. Police concluded that he simply wanted attention. Another suspect emerged when the parents of a young man themselves contacted police after finding Carol Ann's name written inside a notebook. The young man was interrogated, but his alibi was eventually confirmed. Then a name surfaced that completely shook the community. A priest connected to St. Mark Church itself. Investigators discovered that he had lied about where he was on the afternoon of the murder. For some time, fear spread throughout the town. The possibility that a religious figure could be involved in that crime seemed impossible to accept. But after further investigation, police discovered that the priest had lied only to hide an extramarital relationship with a married woman. Morally scandalous, but with no direct connection to the murder. Meanwhile, another man watched the entire investigation in silence. His name was William Schrader. He was 24 years old and lived less than 2 blocks from the church. At the time, almost nobody knew who he truly was. But behind his ordinary appearance, Schrader hid an extremely violent past. A past that years later would make investigators believe that Carol's killer had been standing in front of them from the very beginning. William Schrader had recently arrived in Bristol when Carol was murdered. To the town's residents, he seemed like just another man quietly living in the area. But what almost nobody knew was that Schrader already carried a deeply disturbing history of violence long before crossing paths with Carol Ann Dougherty. Years earlier, he had been arrested for attempted homicide after shooting another man. And the most terrifying part was the way he spoke about it. During an old interview, Schrader coldly stated that next time he would not miss the shot. Investigators would later discover that violent and aggressive behavior had followed William Schrader since childhood. Old records described severe behavioral problems beginning at 8 years old. But in 1962, none of that was known by the residents of Bristol. He was simply a man who lived near the church. Months after the murder, a witness finally came forward to police claiming to have seen Schrader near the church on the day of the crime. According to that person, the man appeared nervous, almost like someone who had just done something terrible. Police then decided to interrogate him. During questioning, Schrader claimed he had been working on the afternoon Carol disappeared. But when investigators checked company records, they discovered he had not shown up for work in days. The alibi was false. Shortly afterward, Schrader also failed a polygraph test and agreed to provide body hair samples for analysis. Everything seemed to be pointing toward him. But before investigators could move further with the case, William Schrader disappeared. He fled Pennsylvania, and throughout the following decades, his whereabouts remained unknown. The primary suspect in the murder had simply vanished without leaving a trace. At the time, although William Schrader was viewed as the main suspect, authorities did not have a confession or genetic analysis technology capable of directly linking him to the crime. And as the years passed, Carol's murder case slowly began to grow cold. Even with suspicion centered on Schrader, investigators never completely ruled out the possibility of another person being involved. The evidence was preserved. The reports were eventually archived. And Carol Ann Dougherty's name became part of the enormous list of unsolved cases in the United States. Meanwhile, the man investigators believed was responsible for the crime continued living freely, believing he had escaped forever. For decades, the case remained practically forgotten. The original detectives retired, Witnesses moved away, grew old, or died. And for Carol Ann Dougherty's family, time only increased the feeling that the truth might never come to light. But advances in technology would begin changing everything. Years later, investigators decided to re-examine the evidence preserved since the time of the crime. What once seemed impossible could now be analyzed using modern DNA techniques capable of finding details invisible to police in the 1970s. The old files were removed from dusty boxes. Crime scene photographs were studied again. Forgotten reports once more passed through investigators' hands. And at the center of everything, one name still kept appearing repeatedly: William Schrader. Even after decades missing, detectives believed he could finally be connected to Carol's murder. The difference was that this time, science was on their side. The case that once seemed condemned to be forgotten was slowly beginning to awaken again. Investigators began a true silent manhunt. After so many years, finding William Schrader would not be simple. He had disappeared during the earliest stages of the investigation, and there were practically no recent records about his life. Even so, detectives followed every available lead. They searched through old documents, public records, forgotten addresses, and information scattered across different American states. Little by little, fragments of Schrader's life began to resurface. While investigators continued revisiting the past, forensic specialists focused their efforts on the evidence preserved since Carol's murder. Every fragment stored throughout the decades began to be treated as an essential piece of a puzzle that might finally be solved. The hope was simple, but ambitious: to use modern technology to discover whether a definitive link existed between the primary suspect and the crime scene. In 1993, Pennsylvania State Police forensic experts began a new analysis of hair samples collected from 176 men investigated over the years. Of the 141 samples that could still be examined, nearly all were eliminated as incompatible with the hairs found with the victim. Except one. The hairs belonging to William Schrader could not be excluded as a possible match to the strands found trapped in Carol Ann Dougherty's left hand on the night of October 22, 1962. The discovery was immediately added to the massive case file, strengthening even further the suspicions surrounding Schrader for decades. But at that moment, science still had limitations. In the early 1990s, DNA testing was still far from the precision it would achieve years later. In addition, much of the evidence had remained stored for decades in the attic of the Bristol Borough Municipal Building, exposed to extreme temperature changes between Pennsylvania's hot summers and harsh winters. When specialists attempted to recover genetic material from that evidence, they discovered that much of it had already deteriorated beyond what the technology of the time could analyze. Then, in 1994, after decades without answers, investigators finally found a decisive lead. William Schrader was still alive. After disappearing from Pennsylvania years earlier, he had moved through different states using new identities to escape his past. First, he fled to Florida. Then he moved to Texas. Later, he eventually settled in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, where he built another life under false documents and a new name. Far from Pennsylvania, Schrader lived an apparently quiet routine. He married a woman who already had a daughter, built a new family, and tried to blend into the local community as if nothing had happened. But according to investigators, behind the appearance of an ordinary man, he continued displaying the same disturbing behavior that had already raised suspicions in the past, abusing women and children around him. Then came another crime. In 1970, his wife's 12-year-old daughter, Catherine Smith, died during a deliberately set fire after a violent domestic argument involving the girl's mother and William Schrader. The circumstances of the case raised serious suspicions against Schrader. Once again, he disappeared. Another name, another city, another attempt to erase his own past. For years, William Schrader managed to continue living in hiding, believing he would escape punishment once again. And for a long time, he truly did. But everything changed in 1994. That year, he was located and arrested for the 1970 case, eventually being convicted of manslaughter and arson. It was during that investigation that authorities discovered his true identity and realized that the same man was also directly connected to the unsolved murder of Carol, a crime that still haunted Pennsylvania more than 3 decades later. That same year, investigators succeeded in extraditing William Schrader from Louisiana back to Pennsylvania. After decades of being considered the primary suspect, he would finally be officially confronted by authorities in the state where Carol had been murdered. Schrader was brought before a grand jury and directly questioned about the crime. The question was simple: had he murdered Carol Ann Dougherty? But Schrader refused to answer. Invoking the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, he exercised his right against self-incrimination and remained silent throughout the entire testimony. Without a confession and still facing difficulties with the physical evidence in the case, prosecutors encountered a massive obstacle. The defense argued that the genetic material analyzed years earlier was far too degraded to be considered reliable in court. Because the evidence had remained stored for decades under inadequate conditions, defense attorneys claimed the tests could not establish a definitive connection between Schrader and the murder. The judge ultimately accepted the defense's challenge. Without evidence considered conclusive and without any confession from Schrader, authorities were unable to file formal charges for the murder of Carol. Shortly afterward, he was sent back to prison in Louisiana, where he continued serving his sentence for crimes related to the 1970 case. William Schrader died in 2002 at the age of 62. For investigators and for Carol Ann Dougherty's family, it was devastating. Although they believed they had finally found the man responsible for the girl's murder, Schrader never spent a single day in prison specifically for the crime committed against Carol in 1962. The case remained without an official conviction, even after decades of investigation. The box of evidence returned to storage once again as another unsolved case. Years after William Schrader's death, the Carol Ann Dougherty case began gaining momentum once again. In 2024, investigators from Bucks County decided to officially reopen the investigation. After decades marked by inconclusive leads and frustration, they believed modern advances in forensic genetics and investigative techniques could finally close the mystery that had haunted Pennsylvania since 1962. All of the material stored in the case was reviewed once again, page by page, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. That was when they found something that had been forgotten for years inside the personal files of a retired detective. A letter dated 2007. The document mentioned Robert LeBlanc, a man who had known William Schrader in prison. According to the letter, Robert told his parole officer that Schrader had confessed Carol Ann Dougherty's murder to him. The officer immediately forwarded the information to Bucks County. The tip was documented, archived, and never investigated. Perhaps because, at that moment, many believed there was no point in pursuing a case whose primary suspect had already been dead for years. Perhaps because nobody imagined it would still be possible to reach a definitive conclusion. But for the new investigators, it meant everything. Even after Schrader's death, officially confirming his responsibility for Carol's murder represented justice for the family and closure for one of the region's oldest cases. Under the leadership of Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Schorn, a new investigative grand jury was convened for one final attempt to solve the case. Investigators from Bucks County and the Pennsylvania State Police traveled to Louisiana to personally speak with Robert LeBlanc. Now elderly, Robert finally decided to tell everything he knew. According to him, Schrader had confessed to the crime for the first time many years earlier in Devil's Swamp, Louisiana, shortly after the 1962 murder. At the time, Schrader was drinking with Robert LeBlanc and another man when, unexpectedly, he began talking about a crime committed in Pennsylvania. According to Robert LeBlanc's account, William Schrader claimed he had committed the perfect crime. He said he had sexually assaulted a little girl on the altar of a church in a town called Bristol and then killed her to prevent her from telling anyone what had happened. He spoke about it all with absolute coldness, like someone convinced he would never be held accountable. Robert LeBlanc heard the confession and carried those words in his memory for decades. Years later, the two men would meet again in a Louisiana prison, and according to Robert LeBlanc, Schrader confessed again. This time, Robert decided to ask directly why Carol had to die. The answer came without hesitation. "I had to kill the girl in Bristol to stop her from talking." According to Robert, Schrader spoke those words without any sign of remorse, fear, or guilt. For investigators, it raised a disturbing question. Why would someone reveal such a brutal crime to practically a stranger? Later, a forensic psychologist who analyzed Schrader's behavior concluded that he displayed strong psychopathic personality traits, impulsiveness, violence, lack of empathy, and a compulsive need to relive and share his own crimes. And it was exactly that detail that would end up changing the entire direction of the investigation. William Schrader's need to talk about his own crimes. With the testimonies gathered, the old evidence reviewed, and the new forensic analyses completed, investigators finally believed they had built the definitive case against him. After decades of uncertainty, the puzzle finally seemed complete. The final investigative report was 53 pages long. On October 29, 2025, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Schorn appeared behind a podium in Doylestown, accompanied by investigators from the Pennsylvania State Police and officers from Bristol Borough. Exactly 63 years and 1 day had passed since the moment Carol Ann Dougherty's father climbed into the choir loft of St. Mark Church and found his daughter's body. An image that would remain with him for the rest of his life. That day, before the press and authorities, William Frederick Schrader was officially identified as responsible for the sexual assault and murder of Carol Ann Dougherty on October 22, 1962. The grand jury concluded that Schrader was solely responsible, based on the complete body of evidence accumulated over decades. The forensic analysis of the hairs found on the victim, the false alibi presented at the time of the crime, his sudden flight from Pennsylvania, and the 2 confessions made years later in Devil's Swamp and in the Louisiana prison. The district attorney's office formally approved charges of murder, sexual assault, and destruction of evidence against Schrader. But there was one detail that could never be changed. William Schrader had died in 2002. A dead man cannot be brought to trial, cannot be handcuffed, cannot sit before a jury, cannot look at the victim's family and answer for what he did. For years, Schrader bragged about the crime to other criminals, believing he would never be discovered, and he ultimately died in prison serving time for a completely different case, taking with him answers that may never be fully known. The investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. The murder of Carol Ann Dougherty was likely only one part of the violence that marked William Schrader's entire life. According to records gathered by authorities, he sexually abused women and children around him for decades. Daughters, stepdaughters, granddaughters, and vulnerable young girls were allegedly targeted precisely because they had less ability to report or resist. At least 7 cases of sexual abuse were officially documented, and investigators believe there may have been many more. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all is this: how many secrets did William Schrader take with him to the grave? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel to follow other real cases that remained unsolved for decades until new evidence finally revealed the truth. Because sometimes time can hide a crime, but it can never completely erase it.